Part 2. As they continued their hurried exit from the hospital, the oppressive silence of Pripyat seemed to hang in the air. Their hearts were still pounding from the tense encounter in the abandoned building, and now, with every step, they felt as though someone, was still watching them. "I'm starting to think we made a mistake coming here," Stewie muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see something or someone emerge from the shadows. "Too late for that now," Matt replied, his voice sharp. "We're already in this, and we need to keep going." The trio moved quickly through the narrow, crumbling streets of Pripyat. The buildings around them were like hollowed-out shells, their glass windows shattered, their metal frames rusted. It felt as though the city itself had been abandoned by time, and the eerie quiet only intensified their unease. "I've been thinking," Eric said, his tone quieter than usual. "We've been in this city for days, and we haven't seen a single person, not even a stray animal. It doesn't feel like we're just in an abandoned town. It feels like we're being kept here." Stewie nodded slowly. "You're right. It's too quiet, almost unnatural." "I don't know," Matt said, looking around with growing concern. "But whatever is going on, we need to stick together. We can't afford to split up again." They paused near an overgrown street corner. The road ahead was blocked by a collapsed building, but there was a narrow alley that led around it. They could see the remains of a streetlight still flickering faintly in the distance. "Let's keep moving. We don't want to stay out here too long," Eric urged. The group silently made their way down the alley, trying to stay as inconspicuous as possible. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating more decaying remnants of the once thriving town. But just as they rounded a corner, a sudden noise broke the silence. Something that sounded like a door creaking open, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Did you hear that?" Stewie whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The others froze. The footsteps weren't normal. There was something strange about the rhythm. It wasn't the sound of a human, but more like something dragging itself along the ground. The trio quickly ducked into the nearest doorway, their hearts racing. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped, right outside the building they were hiding in. The air felt thick with tension, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. For what felt like an eternity, they held their breath, waiting for the sounds to fade. Finally, the dragging noises continued, moving away from them into the distance. "That was too close?" Matt muttered, exhaling deeply. "We can't let our guard down again." Eric nodded in agreement. "This place is alive with something, or someone, but it's not human." They waited a few more minutes before cautiously stepping out of the doorway. The street was empty again, but the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had only intensified. "We need to find a way out of here," Stewie said, scanning the horizon, "before whatever that was comes back." "Let's head for the outskirts of the city," Eric suggested. "We can find a place to camp out, figure out our next move." With a shared sense of urgency, the trio continued their trek through Pripyat. The quiet streets seemed to stretch on forever, but in the back of their minds, they all knew the city held secrets far darker than they could comprehend. As they moved deeper into the ruins, their path began to feel more like a maze, every turn seeming to lead them in circles. They were lost, both physically and mentally, and the weight of their situation was beginning to sink in. Suddenly they heard it again, a low, unsettling growl, echoing from somewhere in the distance. This time, it was closer. "We're not alone," Stewie whispered, his voice barely audible. "Let's move, fast." The trio broke into a sprint, their footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement. But no matter how fast they ran, the growl followed them, as though something or someone was keeping pace, never too far behind. It was clear now, the abandoned city was not as empty as it seemed, and whatever was lurking in the shadows was not going to let them leave without a fight. The growl echoed once again, louder this time, sending a chill down their spines. The trio pushed themselves faster, desperation fueling their every step. They darted down alleys and through forgotten doorways, hoping to lose whatever was pursuing them. But no matter how many corners they turned or how fast they ran, the growl seemed to stay just behind them, never letting up. "Something's following us," Stewie gasped, his breath shallow as they rounded yet another corner. "We need to find somewhere to hide." "Keep going," Eric shouted, eyes scanning the dark, desolate streets for any kind of refuge. We can't stop now. They came to a large open square, the remnants of a once bustling marketplace now overtaken by weeds and decay. Their only options were the abandoned buildings surrounding them, but none of them looked safe enough to hide in. Over there. Matt pointed to an old maintenance shed tucked away behind a row of crumbling structures. That's our best shot. Without hesitation, they rushed towards it, their hearts pounding in their chests. The growl was growing louder now, more distinct, more menacing. Whatever was hunting them was closing in, and they had no idea what they were up against. The shed door creaked as they pushed it open, quickly slipping inside. The small space was dark and smelled of mildew, but it was their only refuge for the moment. They pressed their backs to the walls, holding their breath as they listened for the sound of footsteps. The growl had stopped, but they could hear something else, something far worse. Scratching. It started faintly at first, like nails against metal, but it soon grew louder, more frantic. "Did you hear that?" Stewie whispered, his voice tense with fear. Eric and Matt exchanged glances, both of them equally unnerved. "Yeah," Eric murmured, his hand tightening around the flashlight. "It's close. Whatever it is, it's right outside." The scratching noise grew more insistent, then abruptly stopped. There was a long pause, a silence that stretched on far too long. They could hear their own hearts thudding in their ears, the tension in the air thickening with every passing second. Then, bang. The door to the shed slammed against the wall with enough force to rattle the entire building. It was as though something had just thrown itself against the door, and for a split second, they were sure it would break through. "Move!" Matt shouted, grabbing the others by the arm and pulling them deeper into the shed. They backed into a small corner, trying to stay out of sight. The scratching resumed. This time, it was coming from above. The thing outside was climbing the walls, its claws scraping against the wood and metal. It was toying with them, getting closer, drawing out the moment before it attacked. "This isn't good," Stewie muttered, his face pale with fear. "We're trapped." Eric nodded, his mind racing for a way out. "We need to find another exit, fast. It's not just going to stop." Matt glanced at the small, rusted window in the far corner of the shed. "There's a way out, but we have to move now." They darted toward the window, pulling off the old, rotting boards that had covered it. As soon as they made enough space, they squeezed through one by one, barely avoiding the outstretched claws of whatever was outside. Just as they made it outside, they heard a loud thud, followed by a guttural growl. The creature was on the move again. "Go!" Eric yelled, leading the way into the dark street. They sprinted, adrenaline pushing them harder than ever before. But as they ran, they realized the creature wasn't alone. Shadows seemed to move along the edges of the streets, watching them from the darkness. "We're not just being hunted," Stewie panted. "We're being herded." The trio pushed forward, their legs burning with exhaustion, but they couldn't stop. The thing following them, whatever it was getting closer with each passing second. And the deeper they went into Pripyat, the more they realized that they had only scratched the surface of the horrors lurking within the city's decaying walls. Whatever hunted them wasn't just an animal. It was something far more intelligent, and it wasn't going to let them escape without a fight. The cold night passed slowly, the terror of their narrow escape still fresh in their minds. The following morning, the trio woke in the ruins of an old building they had taken refuge in. The sky was overcast, and the sun barely pierced the thick clouds, casting an eerie pall over the abandoned city. They hadn't dared venture outside the night before, but now the threat that had stalked them seemed to have retreated, at least for the moment. "Do you think it's gone?" Stewie asked, his voice hesitant as he pulled himself to his feet. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of a restless sleep. Eric stood near the window, cautiously peering outside. The streets were still empty, eerily so, but the silence was unnerving. No growls, no sounds of scratching claws, just the distant whisper of wind through the crumbling buildings. "I don't know," Eric replied, his tone serious, "but I'm not sticking around to find out. We need to keep moving." They gathered their things quickly, though none of them had much of an appetite after the terror of the previous night. The unsettling feeling that they were being watched never left, but the immediate threat seemed to have disappeared. As they made their way down the abandoned streets of Pripyat, it felt as if they were walking in the shadow of the city's tragic past. Buildings stood frozen in time, remnants of a life that had been abruptly halted. Toys scattered across playgrounds, newspapers long turned to dust, and personal belongings left behind, as if the inhabitants had vanished without a trace. "This place feels wrong," Matt said, his voice low. "Like it's not just abandoned, it's been abandoned for a reason." Eric nodded grimly. "We're in the heart of it now, no turning back." They continued exploring, moving deeper into the city, though every step felt heavier than the last. They couldn't shake the feeling that the answers they sought were buried somewhere within the decaying buildings. But the longer they stayed, the more they began to wonder if the city was truly abandoned, or if someone, was still lurking in the shadows. As they passed a desolate hospital, the silence around them became almost unbearable. Stewie stopped in his tracks, suddenly feeling a chill crawl down his spine. He looked at his friends, but neither of them had noticed. "What's wrong?" Matt asked, seeing the look on Stewie's face. "There's something wrong with this place," Stewie muttered, glancing nervously at the cracked windows of the hospital. "I can feel it. It's like we're not alone here." Before they could discuss it further, a distant rumbling sound echoed through the city, breaking the heavy silence. It was low and constant, as though something huge was moving beneath the earth. The ground trembled slightly beneath their feet, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the entire city was alive. "What the hell was that?" Matt asked, eyes wide with alarm. Eric raised a hand, signaling for them to be quiet. "I don't know, but we need to find out." They began moving toward the source of the sound, their footsteps quickening. The rumbling grew louder with each step, until it was almost deafening. It led them to a large, sunken structure, perhaps once a government building or an underground facility, that had been buried beneath years of rubble. As they approached, the air grew thick with tension. The ground shook more violently now, and the noise seemed to be coming from deep underground. But when they peered inside the building's shattered entrance, all they saw was darkness. "This doesn't feel right," Stewie said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're too close to something." But before he could finish, the ground trembled again, this time much stronger. They were jolted backward as if something was rising from the earth itself. The noise intensified, reverberating through their bodies, and the city seemed to shake in response. Suddenly, everything stopped. The rumbling ceased. The ground stilled. For a moment, the trio stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. Then, from the depths of the sunken building, a low hum began to emanate. It was not mechanical, not human. It was something far more otherworldly. And in that moment, they realized they had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lay buried within Pripyat's decaying heart. "We need to go," Eric said, his voice tense. "Now." But Stewie, Matt, and Eric all knew deep down that leaving now would only mean facing the unknown later. The city had something to tell them, and they couldn't leave until they had uncovered its secrets, no matter what it took. The trio hurried away from the sunken structure, their footsteps echoing off the cracked pavement. Whatever had been beneath the earth had gone silent, but the oppressive feeling of being watched had returned tenfold. "Did you hear that?" Stewie asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I don't know what I heard," Eric admitted, "but I know we shouldn't be anywhere near this place when night falls." Matt, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, stopped suddenly. He stared at a collapsed apartment building, its skeletal remains jutting into the gray sky. "Guys, look at that." The others followed his gaze. The building itself wasn't unusual, just another ruin in a dead city, but something had been moving inside. A shadow, quick and deliberate, had disappeared behind one of the broken walls. Eric clenched his jaw. "We need to know what's out here. If something's living in this city with us, we can't keep running from it." Against their better judgment, they approached the ruined apartment block, stepping carefully over the debris. The silence around them felt too complete, as if even the wind had decided to hold its breath. They climbed through what had once been a doorway, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The place was a disaster, furniture covered in decades of dust, broken glass littering the floor, and walls covered in peeling Soviet-era posters. Then they saw it, a pile of bones, Not just animal bones, there were human remains mixed in. Skulls, rib cages, and femurs, some cracked as if they had been gnawed on. Matt took a step back, his face pale. This isn't from the disaster. This is recent. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash sounded from above. Something was moving on the higher floors, a heavy, deliberate step. Then another. Eric raised his flashlight toward the stairwell. "We're not alone," he whispered. For a brief moment, they saw a figure. Tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnatural, as if it was trying to mimic the way a person would walk. The thing tilted its head toward them, and then it vanished into the darkness. "Go," Eric ordered, his voice barely above a breath. They ran. Scrambling out of the building, they didn't stop until they were far from the apartment block, panting and wide-eyed. The city remained silent, as if nothing had happened. Matt bent over, catching his breath. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Eric admitted, scanning the area. "But I think we're starting to understand why this place is really abandoned." Stewie looked back toward the ruins. "We need to decide. Do we keep pushing forward, or do we leave before we end up like those bones?" The wind howled through the empty city, and for the first time, Pripyat felt like it was answering them. The three friends sat in silence for a long time after escaping the apartment building. The night had settled in fully, draping Pripyat in an eerie darkness that seemed to absorb all sound. The strange figure they had seen, whatever it was, hadn't followed them. Or at least, it wasn't making its presence known anymore. Eric finally broke the silence. "We can't leave in the middle of the night. We'd never make it back through the forest without getting lost." Stewie nodded, still shaken. "So what do we do? Just sit here and wait for something else to find us?" Matt rubbed his face. "We stay put, find a defensible spot, and wait for sunrise. Whatever is out here, it doesn't seem to like showing itself in daylight." Reluctantly, they agreed. They picked a building that still had most of its walls intact, a small, abandoned store. The windows were broken, but there was enough cover inside to keep them hidden. They set up in the farthest corner, taking turns keeping watch while the others got some rest. The night passed slowly. Every creak of the wind against the broken buildings made their hearts race. Distant noises, impossible to identify, drifted through the empty streets. At one point, Stewie swore he heard breathing just outside their shelter, but when he peeked through the broken window, nothing was there. By the time the first gray light of dawn stretched over the horizon, they were exhausted but alive. "We made it," Eric muttered, stretching his stiff limbs. Stewie stood and peered outside. The city in the early morning looked almost peaceful, its abandoned streets bathed in pale light. Matt slung his backpack over his shoulder. "We need to keep moving, but let's not take any more risks. No more underground tunnels, no more dark buildings." Eric hesitated before nodding. "Agreed. Let's just explore what we can in the open, take our pictures, and then get the hell out of here." With that, they set off, moving cautiously through the empty streets. Pripyat, in the daylight, was still haunting, but without the oppressive weight of night, it was easier to push away the fear. They walked through the amusement park, past the rusting Ferris wheel, and into the overgrown streets leading to the city's outer districts. For a while, it almost felt normal again. Just three friends on an Urbex adventure, but all of them knew, deep down, that something was watching. And it was only a matter of time before it made itself known again. The city felt different in the daylight, less like a ghost town and more like a place that still had eyes on them. Eric, Matt, and Stewie moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows where they could. They had all agreed, no more taking unnecessary risks. Just explore what they could in the open, take their last photos, and get out. They made their way through the amusement park, past rusting bumper cars swallowed by nature, and onto a wide road leading toward an old apartment block. They had just stopped to take a few pictures when Stewie stiffened. "Guys," he hissed, "we've got a problem." Eric and Matt turned to follow his gaze. At the far end of the street, two men in dark uniforms were walking in their direction. "Guards," Matt muttered. "Shit," Eric swore under his breath. "They're not supposed to patrol this deep into the city." Stewie glanced around frantically. "What do we do?" "Run," Matt said. Without another word, they bolted. The guards shouted behind them, and the sound of boots pounding against the cracked pavement sent adrenaline surging through their veins. Eric led the way, weaving through the abandoned streets as fast as his legs would carry him. They turned a corner, cutting between two buildings. The overgrown foliage clawed at their clothes as they pushed through, their backpacks bouncing against their backs. There! Stewie pointed toward an old department store, its glass doors shattered. They ducked inside, careful not to step on the broken glass. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of decay and dust. They crouched behind an overturned counter, struggling to catch their breath. The sound of footsteps slowed outside. The guards were close. Eric held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Through a broken window, he could see one of the men standing just outside, scanning the area. The other was speaking into a radio. "They're calling for backup," Matt whispered. "We can't stay here," Stewie murmured. "We need a distraction." Eric's mind raced. Then he spotted something, a chunk of concrete on the floor. Carefully, he picked it up and threw it toward the far end of the store. It crashed against the wall with a loud bang. The guards reacted immediately, turning toward the noise with their hands on their weapons. "Now!" Matt hissed. They darted out the back entrance, sprinting through the alleys as fast as they could. They didn't stop until they were deep in the ruins of another building, hidden from sight. Panting, Stewie leaned against a wall. That was way too close. "We need to get out of here," Eric said, his voice low. "Tonight." Matt nodded. "Agreed. No more exploring. We've pushed our luck enough." They had come to Pripyat for an adventure. Now, they just wanted to make it out alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three friends remained hidden inside the crumbling remains of an old apartment building. They had barely spoken since their close call with the guards earlier that day. Tension hung in the air. One wrong move, and they could be caught. Eric peeked through a broken window. The streets were quiet, bathed in the eerie glow of moonlight. "I don't see any movement," he whispered. Matt tightened the straps on his backpack. "If we're going to leave, now's the time." Stewie hesitated. "Are we really done? I mean, we came all this way." Eric shot him a sharp look. "Yes, we're done. We were lucky earlier. If they catch us, it won't just be a slap on the wrist." Stewie sighed but nodded. "All right, let's move." They crept out of the building, sticking to the shadows as they navigated the maze of abandoned structures. Every distant sound made their nerves flare. An animal scurrying through the debris, the wind whistling through broken windows, the faint rustling of leaves. Their route led them back through the amusement park, past the skeletal remains of the Ferris wheel. It loomed over them like a silent guardian, its rusting frame a stark reminder of the city's tragic past. As they reached the outskirts of the city, they spotted the checkpoint in the distance. The road leading out of Pripyat was watched carefully, floodlights cutting through the darkness. "We can't go through there," Matt whispered. "Too risky." Eric motioned toward the trees. "We go through the forest. It's longer, but it's safer." They hurried into the thick brush, branches snapping beneath their feet. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The silence of the forest was unsettling, as if the land itself was holding its breath. After nearly an hour of navigating through the wilderness, they finally spotted the road they had used to sneak in days before. Relief flooded them. "We made it," Stewie exhaled. But before they could step onto the pavement, something moved in the trees behind them. A shadow, a flicker of motion. Something was watching them. Eric turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the dark expanse of the forest. "Let's go," he said quickly. Without hesitation, they sprinted across the road, disappearing into the safety of the night. Eric, Matt, and Stewie crouched in the thick underbrush, their breaths shallow as they watched the checkpoint from a safe distance. Their plan to escape had hit a major obstacle. There were far more guards than they had expected. Flashlights swept across the road, and they could hear the muffled voices of men talking and the occasional crackle of a radio. "Damn it," Matt whispered. "There's no way we're getting through that." Eric clenched his fists. They must have increased patrols after what happened earlier. If we try to sneak through, we're done. Stewie exhaled slowly, looking back toward the city. "So what do we do? Hide in the forest all night?" Eric shook his head. "Too risky. If they have patrols here, they might start sweeping the woods. We need to go back into Pripyat, find a better hiding spot, and wait it out. Maybe try again tomorrow night." Matt sighed in frustration, but nodded. "Fine, let's move before we get spotted." Carefully, they turned back toward the city, moving through the dense trees to avoid open spaces. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft crunch of their boots against the leaf-covered ground. Then a noise, a rustling in the undergrowth. The three of them froze. The sound came again, something moving through the trees behind them. Heavy, deliberate steps. Stewie slowly reached for his flashlight, but stopped when Eric grabbed his wrist. "Don't," he whispered. The rustling grew closer. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. Then, just beyond the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, they saw it, two glowing eyes staring at them from the shadows. A wolf. It was massive, its thick fur matted and dark, blending almost perfectly with the forest. Its eyes reflected the dim light, unblinking and predatory. Matt swallowed hard. "Is it rabid?" he whispered. Stewie barely moved his lips. "I don't know. Just don't run." The wolf stepped forward, its head lowering slightly as if assessing them. Its breath was visible in the cold air, slow and steady. Eric knew that turning their backs and running would be the worst thing they could do. Instead, he slowly raised his arms, making himself appear larger. "Easy. We don't want any trouble," he murmured. The wolf's ears twitched. For a long moment, it simply watched them. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees. The three stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. Finally, Stewie let out a shaky exhale. "Okay, that was terrifying. Let's get out of here," Eric muttered. Without another word, they hurried back into the ruined city, realizing that Pripyat, despite its emptiness, was far from abandoned. Eric, Matt, and Stewie moved quickly through the outskirts of Pripyat, their nerves still rattled from the encounter with the wolf. The creature had left them alone, but the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't just the animals, the patrols, or even the eerie emptiness of the city. It was something else, something they couldn't quite explain. They made their way back to the apartment complex they had used before, an old Soviet-era building with peeling paint and broken windows. As they stepped inside, Matt leaned against the wall, exhaling deeply. "That was insane," he muttered. "I don't know what's worse, the guards or the damn wildlife." Eric peeked through the dusty blinds, scanning the streets below. "We got lucky. If we had kept going, we would have been caught for sure. We need a better plan." Stewie set his backpack down and sat on the floor. "So what do we do? Wait for another night?" Eric nodded. "Yeah, but we need to find a different route out. If security is this tight, they must have cameras or motion sensors we haven't seen." Matt groaned. "We're running out of food. We planned for a few days, but not this long. If we don't get out soon, we're going to have bigger problems." A deep silence fell over them. They had underestimated just how difficult leaving Pripyat would be. After a while, Eric stood up. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll check out the train tracks, maybe follow them out of here." The others nodded, too exhausted to argue. They secured the doors and windows, making sure they wouldn't be taken by surprise. But as they lay down to rest, a new sound reached them, something scraping against the outside of the building. Stewie's eyes snapped open. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Eric sat up, listening. The sound was faint but steady, like nails dragging across concrete. Matt slowly moved to the window, peeking through a crack. His breath hitched. "Guys, you're gonna want to see this." Eric and Stewie joined him, peering outside. There in the middle of the street stood a figure. It was human-shaped but too thin, its limbs slightly too long. It stood motionless, facing the building. Stewie swallowed hard. "That's not a guard." Matt pulled away from the window. "I don't care what it is. We are not going outside tonight." The three of them backed away, their hearts pounding. Pripyat wasn't just dangerous because of the guards, the radiation, or the animals. Something else was here, and it didn't want them to leave. The figure outside remained motionless for what felt like an eternity. Eric, Matt, and Stewie barely dared to breathe as they watched from the window, afraid to make any sudden movement. The way it stood, rigid, unnatural, made their skin crawl. Then, without warning, it was gone. Not in the way someone would turn and walk away. It was just no longer there. 1 second, it was in the street. The next, nothing but empty space remained. Matt swallowed hard. "I hate this place." Eric exhaled, trying to shake the tension from his body. "We're getting out of here at first light." None of them slept. The hours stretched on, every creak of the abandoned building making them flinch. As soon as the first hints of dawn filtered through the broken windows, they packed up their gear and prepared to leave. Moving quickly, they navigated through the crumbling apartment complex and out into the desolate streets. The city, bathed in the cold light of morning, felt even more abandoned than before. They had planned to follow the railway tracks leading toward the outskirts of Pripyat, but after checking their surroundings, they decided on a safer route, through the ruins of an old marketplace, away from open spaces where they could be spotted. As they weaved through the skeletal remains of old buildings, they heard distant voices. Eric signaled for them to stop. They crouched behind an overturned truck, peering toward the sound. A small group of guards was patrolling a street near the Ferris wheel, talking amongst themselves. "Let's go the other way," Stewie whispered. They turned and moved in the opposite direction, taking a longer but safer route. The last thing they needed was to get caught trespassing. They passed through an old grocery store, the shelves long empty, then through an alleyway filled with rusted bicycles and abandoned strollers. The eerie silence of Pripyat was suffocating. When they finally reached a section of the city close to the woods, Eric pointed toward an old industrial facility. "If we go through there, we can circle back to our original exit point. No more detours after that." They hurried inside, moving through dusty corridors and rusting stairwells. Just as they reached the far exit, Stewie suddenly grabbed Eric's arm. "Do you hear that?" A faint, clicking sound echoed from the hall behind them. Not footsteps, something else. A mechanical rhythm, distant yet distinct. Matt's face paled. "We need to move." They didn't wait to find out what it was. Breaking into a run, they darted out of the building and into the open air, sprinting toward the tree line. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the city loomed behind them in silence. No voices, no footsteps. Whatever had been following them, if anything had been following them, was gone. They kept moving. Hours later, as they finally reached their extraction point near the exclusion zone's border, Stewie glanced back at the skyline of Pripyat. "I don't think we were supposed to be there," he murmured. Eric adjusted his backpack. "We were lucky. Let's not push that luck any further." Without another word, they turned and left the ghost city behind, carrying with them memories they would never be able to explain. End of part 2.